Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Ina, for all of the incredibly smooth arrangements. It's been really great. It's wonderful to be back here in Ann Arbor in a building that I'm confident did not exist when I was a graduate student here several decades ago. Yeah, so I know that we've just got an hour, so I'll jump right in. I'm going to be talking about Wang Yangming, the Ming Dynasty, great Ming Dynasty, Neo-Confucian philosopher today. And just start out by, let's see, if I click here. There we go. Start out by giving you a little bit of context for why I'm going to talk about what I am. So in the last 2 years, Harvey Liederman, who's a philosopher based at UT Austin, has published a number of essays, including the two on the screen, that have, I would say, rekindled a certain amount of interest in Wang Yangming on the part of analytically inclined philosophers. Harvey's work is unusually sort of precise and rigorous, and it's gotten a lot of attention both in the US and the Anglophone world, and also over in Asia. I saw him a couple months ago in Taiwan, where he was staying at Academia Sinica and giving a number of lectures. So it's really a fascinating project that he's been developing. And among other things, at the core of this is what he calls an introspective model for understanding what Wang Yangming means by genuine knowing. And for those of you who are familiar with Wang Yangming, you know that the idea of liangzhi, good knowing, or pure knowing, innate moral knowledge, a lot of different ways to translate that, but I'll translate it as good knowing, is absolutely central to Wang Yangming. And more generally, the idea that knowledge and action are unified in some sense. So this idea of knowledge is really important for Wang Yangming. And so Liederman has put forward this quite distinctive, even revolutionary understanding of what the whole field of knowledge claims is supposed to be in Wang Yangming. So, and he argues against a number of other models, most prominently what he calls the perceptual model, which he attributes to a number of interpretations of Wang Yangming, including my own. What I'm going to try to argue for today is an account of Wang Yangming's ideas related to knowing, that is consistent with, I don't know if it's exactly the same as, but it's at least consistent with what Justin Tewald and I have argued for in a book that came out in maybe 2017 called Neo-Confucianism: A Philosophical Introduction. Now, that is a book that covers a broad range of thinkers and time and topics, and so I would be the first to acknowledge that it does not contain a super detailed, careful, precise argument for the interpretation we offer of Wang Yangming. And so partly what I'm trying to do today is to return to some of those ideas, but to do so more carefully in reaction to Harvey's arguments. So in that book, what we say is that liangzhi, or good knowing, is perfect self-correcting emotion. That itself is a unusual interpretation of what liangzhi is about. And partly what I'm going to try to do today is to convince you that something like that might be plausible. So there's two main ideas to the talk, so core idea one is what I think is a pretty widely accepted, although perhaps not often deeply probed idea, namely that the Shin, or heart-mind, integrates cognitive and affective functions in one thing. And I mean integrates in a really deep sense. So it's not just that we have cognition and affect that are somehow alongside one another, but they're actually unified or integrated in a serious way, as I'll try to describe. And then the second core idea is it's going to be a little bit more in the background, but that has to do with to what degree it's appropriate when talking about Wang Yangming and the kinds of topics related to zhi that I'm going to be discussing, to what degree it's appropriate to say that that is about epistemology, that it's about knowledge, and so on. And I'm not saying that it's not, but I think we have to be cautious about that, because if we sort of approach questions of knowing, knowledge, epistemology with a certain set of assumptions about what that could be, then I think that's going to limit us in our understanding of what Wang Yangming is up to. So the structure of the talk has three parts. I'm going to start by saying a little bit more about the perceptual model and the introspective models of genuine knowing. And I'll both highlight a few features of Harvey's argument and also point out to some degree where it seems to me he is not ignoring is too strong, but let's say sidelining the role of affect in Wang's picture. So he's going to say, and if we were pressed, he would say, yeah, okay, it's there, but it's clearly not doing important explanatory work. I'm then going to look at four passages, and I think, is there a handout that's available? Great. So the passages are all there, and each of these passages, it seems to me, points towards an important aspect of this sort of knowing set of ideas that is going to push us in the direction of a model that centers affect. And then the third part is going to go through that in a little bit more detail, a little bit more systematically, with a focus on the relationship that Wang himself clearly takes very seriously between the Benti and the Yung, the Ti and the Yung. That structure, which I'll explain when we get there. Yeah, so that's the plan. So part one, perceptual and introspective models. So according to Harvey, the perceptual model of understanding knowing in Wang Yangming is a widespread view. He attributes it to the folks on the screen, among others. And it's interesting in light of the argument that I'm making today that he ends up focusing on perception in part because he notices a real interest on the part of these scholars in affect. So he says that the people who are interested in the perceptual model want to emphasize the appropriate that we appropriately acknowledge features of the world around one as consisting in part in having an appropriate affective response to them, right? So even though he calls it the perceptual model, right, and his arguments against it very much focus on perception, he recognizes that the motivation one might have for having a perceptual model has to do with affect. And it's worth saying that nobody says, I hold a perceptual model of genuine knowing, right? This is something that Harvey sort of invents in order to try to get traction on the strengths and weaknesses of these views. So he distinguishes between a weak kind of perceptual model and a strong perceptual model. And on the weak view, perception plays some role somehow in the process of knowing. On the strong view, genuine knowing just is perceiving. So to genuinely know filiality would be to perceive filiality, right? And he says, I think quite plausibly, that strong view is false, right? It's not the case that to genuinely know filial piety or filiality is to perceive it out there, right? You perceive your parents, but that perceiving your parents isn't to know filiality. Knowing if filiality is somehow in you and not in them. So the strong view is false. The weak view, he says, might be true, but it's too weak to really do enough philosophical work. And so he sets aside the perceptual view. He does this at more length in these papers, but that's the basic idea. So once again, he sees a family of views out there and thinks that what they have in common and their key point is an emphasis on perception. And indeed, you see people, all those folks he mentioned, including myself, make references to perception in various ways. So he says, okay, we can sort of abstract away from the differences and view these as understanding Wang through the lens of perception. And if we do that on the strong view, which would actually be philosophically interesting, well, then it's false. Wang does not think that. and the weak view is uninteresting. And he furthermore goes on to challenge what he thinks is the underlying motivation of people reading Wang through the lens of perception, which is this idea that genuine knowing is about some kind of sensitivity. And I think that that is, well, I'm going to come back to that, because while I don't want to defend a perceptual view, I do think that sensitivity is important. And there's a relationship between sensitivity and affect and having a kind of emotional feeling response. So that's briefly his argument against the perceptual view. Now, one thing that he argues, which is going to be important to my argument as well, so I think that understanding his framework requires understanding this point, and I think, and I accept this argument that he makes, is that we need to distinguish between liangzhi, or good knowing, and zhenzhi, or genuine knowing. One thing that people have regularly said in response to Harvey's work is that genuine knowing isn't, they argue it's not really distinct from liangzhi. And in fact, the term zhenzhi, or genuine knowing, occurs quite rarely in Wang's corpus. But I think it's plausible to think that something like genuine knowing is actually in play a lot of times, even if Wang is not using that specific term. And furthermore, I think that Harvey's argument, which I'll go through here now, is persuasive, that there has to be a distinction between the sort of innate good knowing liangzhi and genuine knowing, that is the state of actually sort of fully knowing or fully juring, whatever exactly that is. We're going to go on and talk about that. Because he points out that in the midst of doing a bad thing, right? Wang says this, right? In the midst of doing a bad thing, you can have a good inclination, right? So you can be, I don't know, being rude to someone and feel badly about that. And furthermore, your liangzhi can know that that good inclination is right. But he would not accept that you are experiencing genuine knowing of how to interact with this other person because you're being rude to them, right? So you can have liangzhi at the same time as you don't have genuine knowing. So they have to be different, right? That's the core idea. So his view, and if you want to learn more about this, we'll have a little bit of Q&A, or you can read his long and complicated but very, very interesting papers. But his view is that genuine knowing is when your liangzhi is not obscured, and that's, I think, something Wang says quite clearly. And he then cashes out the liangzhi being not obscured in terms of having unconflicted knowledge, which he then explains as having a lack of doxastic conflicts. Doxastic is a word that basically means belief. So you have a lack of conflict in your belief-like states. And if you're familiar with Western epistemology, well, that sounds a lot like this, something that would be of interest to epistemologists. And so he's got a whole explanation of how this, which he calls an introspective model, because it's about the relationship among the inner states. It's not about perception. It's not about various other models that he looks at. It is not, I think there's a degree to which the name introspective model is a little bit misleading, because I think normally when we hear introspection, we think that, okay, I'm actively introspecting. I'm looking within to sort of see what's there. And it's certainly not the case that in order to have genuine knowing, we have to occurrently look within and realize we have genuine knowing. Right? That would be an odd thing to think, that you can only really know something when you take a further step of asking yourself if you really know it. But as he says very explicitly, he doesn't mean introspection in that sense. He just means that there is this relationship among your internal mental states, which is called introspection in certain philosophical literatures, and so that's why he uses it. Okay, so I'm not really going to dig into the more details about his view, right? But the idea is to sort of take this point, which I think is important from him, and then to begin to push back a little bit. Well, I guess I lied slightly because I'm going to give you one example that he gives by way of trying to understand what it is to have a doxastic conflict or a lack of doxastic conflicts. And he gives this example of a person, a native Chinese speaker who pronounces zh in the correct way, but has come to think that he or she does it in an incorrect way. And so there's a sense then in which, because the person does it the right way, there's a sense in which they know how to make this sound. But there's also a sense in which they don't know, right? Because they think they're wrong. And so there is this conflict between an implicit correct belief and an explicit incorrect belief, right? So such a person does not genuinely know how to pronounce zhe, even though they know it, but they don't genuinely know it, right? That's his example. And you can imagine, obviously, someone who knows how to do it and knows they know how to do it and is not conflicted, and that person has genuine knowledge, right? So that's his way of fleshing out this idea. Now, my first moment of pushback is to question whether this is really capturing what Wang Yangming has in mind in a case of conflict. And so here's a passage that Harvey discusses. And there's lots to say about the specifics of translations of technical terms. And if you want to ask about that later, I'd be happy to talk about that. But and this is on the handout, I believe. So Wang says that when a good motivating concern arises, the liangzhi of your mind already knows that it is good. Suppose you do not wholeheartedly love it, but instead turn away from it and diminish it. You would then be taking what is good to be bad and obscuring your liangzhi, which knows that it's good, right? So somehow the zh example is supposed to be like this, because you know how to say it, but you're resisting it somehow, right? In some sense. But I want to ask whether this fu bei or chu zhi, right, turning away from and diminishing or removing, there's an argument about exactly how to read shu here. Is this just a doxastic conflict? It's just a conflict between beliefs. And notice that in the case of the zhe person, it's not clear that there's a motivation to change. It's not clear how motivation or feeling comes into the picture at all. And as I was reading this, I'm reminded of a somewhat similar example, which I've run into a number of times with Chinese friends who, because when they were young with little hands, they couldn't hold chopsticks in the sort of officially approved way. And so they kind of, do it in a, and then they never change because it still works. And so, there's a sense in which they know they're doing it the wrong way, but they keep doing it and they have zero motivation to change, right? So that seems like there's a kind of doxastic conflict, but it seems to be more going on with Wang here than something like that. So I want to suggest an alternative. Imagine you are walking down the street and notice sort of out of the corner of your eye, a panhandler, somebody who you anticipate, or maybe you've even seen them before, is going to ask you for money, and you look at your phone and look up and look anywhere but at this person, and don't make eye contact. And in part, what you're doing is making sure that your sort of compassion doesn't engage. Your feeling of respect for another human being, doesn't go on because I don't see you, right? Maybe you're in a hurry, whatever the story is, right? Surely we can imagine things like that. I know I've done that. Maybe you have too. So I think that what you're doing is more literally turning your back, right? Turning away from a potential sort of provocation. And in effect, you're avoiding allowing your liangzhi to engage, right? Now, I would say you're not shutting off your Liangzhi entirely. It's impossible to do that. And how that comes out phenomenologically is a little just going to depend on the details. And as I suggest on the screen, you might imagine as you're walking by, I don't have any change with me next time, something like that. So there's might well be a conflicted set of beliefs that you have, but there's other stuff going on also, right? There are feelings that are very important here, and you're in fact consciously, or maybe, I mean, this might happen unconsciously, but you're avoiding allowing those feelings to really engage. So that seems to me to be a better example, a richer example that is much more like what Wang has in mind here. And, in passing, perception, there's a role. Obviously, if you're literally trying to not look, then perception is doing something, but it doesn't seem to be central to the knowing. Okay, so that's a rapid engagement with Harvey. And an effort to begin to suggest that if we look at a richer kind of example that seems to fit better with what Wang is thinking about, it's pointing towards other sorts of things going on. So now I'm going to try to keep going at a good pace, because to my mind, the most interesting stuff is in the third part of the talk. So I want to make sure that we have time for that. So as I've already mentioned, so now we're going to have four passages, which are on your handout. So as I've already said, Harvey pushes back against the idea that sensitivity is an important part of knowing. And so in the first passage, I'm just offering something that seems to me to put some emphasis on something like sensitivity and a connection to knowing. So it seems like there are at least two or maybe multiple grades, perhaps, of zhi. And okay, let me pause for a moment and parenthetically say that in the paper that I'm working on, that this is based on, at this point, I stopped translating zhi because I think that there is a temptation, if you say knowledge or knowing, right? There's a temptation to think, okay, we more or less know what that means. And I'd like us to sort of prescind from those assumptions about what knowing and knowledge is, or broadly what epistemology is, and just try to think, okay, what is juring about? So I say things, I say juring and so on. And so in some of the slides, I might be doing the same thing, just to try to, I'm not denying that jur has some clear connection to the way that to ideas of knowing and knowledge. In fact, I'll return to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, so it does seem like this is a passage that brings out a kind of sensitivity to the environment and connects it to knowing, right? Acting is intelligent, and when acting is intelligent and finally observing, it is knowing. Another passage is this wonderful relationship that Wang brings out between knowing and water. So knowing is like water, that our heart mind is never without Liangzhi, is like the fact that water is never without an impulse to go down. So what I want to emphasize here is that zhering is not just a sort of a static or passive kind of thing, right? Zhering has built into it a directionality and a tendency to action in a way that it's not obvious that a simple cognitive state would have. Okay. So context for the third passage is, so a very important category for Wang that I've mentioned just in passing so far is inclination, or yi. As I understand it, basically all of our reactions to stimuli are yi. And that includes things that are explicitly categorized as emotions, right, as qing. And this is something that we could certainly talk more about. Most Neo-Confucians use qing as their main category for the reactions that our heart minds have to stimuli. For whatever reason, we can talk about why, Wang uses E instead and seems to use Qing as a sort of subcategory of E. So inclination is a very important inclusive category. And what Harvey has said, at least in conversation, can't remember whether this is, I think he actually makes this argument quickly in writing, that if you were to push the idea that during is affective, that seems to collapse the distinction between during and, as it were, eing and inclination, between knowing, episodes of knowing and episodes of inclination. And Wang clearly wants to distinguish them. So as Harvey emphasizes, we can even see Wang in the passage on the bottom of the screen here saying that he's interested in what Liang-Zhi knows, not in what Liang-Zhi feels or Liang-Zhi desires, right? So it does seem to be the case that Wang wants to make a distinction between inclinations and feeling and affect on the one hand and during on the other hand. So that might seem like a pretty strong piece of evidence for his view, or at least a criticism of what I'm beginning to suggest. But I think that there's a way we can view it from the opposite way round. And that is, in this passage, what we see is a correspondent of Wang's talking about how easy it is to confuse Qing and E and Zhi. In fact, in this case, in Liang-Zhi. So they are phenomenologically very similar, such that one can confuse one for the other, right? Now, you can't imagine confusing a belief with a desire, right? The belief that there's no food in the house and the desire to eat food are different from one another, even if they might interact with one another in certain ways. So it seems to me that yes, they're distinct from one another, but that doesn't mean, I think it's drawing too strong a conclusion to say, aha, therefore, Zhi cannot be affective. All right, and then the final passage, which is going to point us towards part 3, is this passage. The good knowing is simply a place in which one's clear consciousness of cosmic pattern is spontaneously revealed. Its inherent reality is simply a sincere commiseration, right? So that is, its benti, right, is 真诚慈大. This thing that I've highlighted here. And so that seems pretty important, right? He's telling us what it is. But he's using this category of benti, which is sort of notoriously difficult. And to my reading, I think that Harvey doesn't really say a lot about all the different things Wang says about the Ti-Yung, the benti and Yung relationship, in part because it seems mysterious, too metaphysical, who knows what. But I think that we should pay a lot of attention to the idea that the inherent reality of good knowing is apparently an emotion, right? Is tsuda, commiseration. Now, commiseration is an interesting and complicated thing. Here's a couple brief passages from Jushi, from the Zhuzi Yulei, where he uses it to describe one's feeling for a deceased relative. And then the second passage is even more important, where he's discussing the ways in which the 4 sprouts, right, the Siduan, are ultimately all manifestations of Ren, of humaneness. And so there's some kind of relationship between the first sprout, the Ciyinjishin, and Suda. But Suda, or commiseration, seems to be even more basic ultimately. At any rate, there's lots of interesting things to say about commiseration, and I'll say a tiny bit more in a moment. But the main point is, this passage seems to say, at least one way of reading it is that Liang-Zhi, at least no, I think I'll say more about that in a moment, that essentially Liang-Zhi is in some sense an emotion, right? So we've got to take that super seriously if we think that if we're trying to understand this whole sort of ecology of knowing or juring. And that then suggests to me that while Harvey prefers to translate Xin as mind, thinking not anything really hangs on it, I want to push back against that. And first of all, use a different translation. Not that, I mean, Harvey can use mind, that word, any way he wants. And he can use it to say it includes affective states and so on and so forth. Certainly, Western philosophy of mind includes talk of desires and so on. But I think that by using a different translation, and I've come to realize that I actually strongly prefer heart-mind with no hyphen, right? Heart-mind is probably the most common thing people use these days, but that puts too much of a distinction between the affect and the cognition, in my view, because I think they're really together. So let's just make it one word. Right. I think this is clear enough. Alrighty. Charging along. So, as I've suggested already, I want to take Benti more seriously. Harvey's translation is original natural condition, which is okay. The translation that Justin and I arrived at is inherent reality. And as we explained in that previous book, what we mean by that is that it is inherent in the sense that it's always there. I'm not sure entirely how different this is from the word essence, right? But it depends on what you mean by essence and what the context is there. But it's what the thing sort of considered on its own without any other things influencing it. That's what it is. That's its Benti. So it's like the impulse of water to go down, at least as somebody like Wang Yangming would understand it. And importantly, the Benti, or the inherent reality, is approximated by a thing's earliest state, but it's not the same as a thing's earliest state. And especially in later Neo-Confucianism, even post-Wang Yangming, you get a lot of talk about the child's mind and so on and so forth. And on my account, I think some of these philosophers actually conflate the earliest chronological state and the Benti, and I think that is something that Wang at least would consider to be a mistake. But that earliest chronological state does give us kind of an approximation of what the inherent reality is. Okay, so that's Benti. And now this is my favorite part. This is on the back of your handout. This is an effort to line up in columns things that Wang says are functions Yung and inherent reality, T or Benti, in relation to one another. So all the things in column 1 are functions of the things in column 2. All right. And then in turn, the things in column 2 are functions of the things in columns 3 and 4. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit of detail. There's a lot to be said. I think there are things on here I'm not even going to mention. But let's start with this column 1. All right. So column 1 includes inclinations and emotions. Parenthetically, including one of the 7 emotions is joy. One of the teaching is joy, but there's also joy over here. We may have time to come to that. But anyways, inclinations, emotions, knowing, and then in some sense, the heart mind itself are all functions of sort of manifestations is the wrong way to think about it. But they're functions of the things over here. And so one of the things that presses us to ask is, well, so what do these things have in common? And in particular, given our topic, how is it that knowing or juring is like these other things in column 1? So we'll come back to that. And now, what about column 2? How are they related? And what do they mean? So column 2 has good knowing, Liangjun. So Wang will say things like, the Bunti of Yi, or Qing, is Liangzhi, right? And he'll also make this distinction between the human heart-mind, the Renxin, and the Wei heart-mind, the Daoxin, right? So the Daoxin is the Bunti of Renxin. So what does all this mean? Well, it seems to me, and I've tried to explain here, that the things in column 1, inclinations we'll use as our example, when they're on their own, unobscured, uncorrupted by selfishness or calculation or extrinsic motives, unattached, right? These are all different sorts of language that Wang Yangming uses. But when we think about it in its sort of in itself, right? It's that. Okay. So an inclination, right? A feeling of friendship. I saw an old grad school friend last night, right? So I was experiencing these emotions, these inclinations, and so on. And insofar as they were uncontaminated by selfishness and so on and so forth, that's just Liangzhi. That inclination itself is Liangzhi. So that's why I say manifestation is a little bit wrong. It's not like this is not a Kantian sort of noumena phenomena distinction, right? Where there are different ontological realms. However, crucially, the things in column 1 can do what Wang says is shirqi banti, to lose its inherent reality. So that inclination of friendship loses its inherent reality insofar as there's other stuff going on, insofar as I want to borrow some money from my friend, or whatever. Something else is sort of polluting it or obscuring it partially. Okay. So then we can ask about this relationship. I think that, as you say in here, I've labeled both of these as the inherent reality of this column's function, and the relationship between column 3 and column 4 is complicated. Probably has to do with a difference of generality. I'm not going to focus on this, although this is, I think, fascinating stuff. I'd be happy to talk more, although we're going to run out of time. But the big thing, the big takeaway here, or the big point to make about columns 3 and 4 is that column 1 is the only one which we can say can lose its inherent reality. So if you have Liangzhi, Liangzhi can't lose its own inherent reality. So Liangzhi, in a certain sense, just is zhencheng cida. And in fact, if we go back to that passage about commiseration, there's a kind of funny grammar there where he's saying it's the Bunti, but it is the same thing itself. So he seems to really equate these as well as saying that one is the Bunti of the other. And these various other things, the special sense of joy. So somehow Liangzhi is both commiseration and joy. That's interesting, and again, something we could talk more about. And then if you go even to a deeper level, there are cosmic patterns, sheng sheng bushi, the wang wu ti, and so on and so forth. All of these things are different perspectives on ultimately the same thing. But our focus is on columns 1 and 2 so we can understand zhi. So if we try to make a connection between the 4 passages in part 2 and the chart of interdependencies that I was just looking at, so we can go through each one. So the first passage in part 2 emphasized that there are different grades of zhi, and that favored ones are connected to fine observation and to action. Well, one of the things I would call attention to then is the relationship to this the ling parts, translated here as vital and efficacious parts of pattern, right? That seems like we can build out an argument that vitality is related to action, is related to sensitivity to environment, and so on and so forth. The tendency to action is connected up to what I was just saying, as well as the suggestion of the column 1, the parallels in column 1, that if Yi and Qing are clearly related to motivation and action. Well, then if they have the same Bunti, then zhi should also. And I think the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory. So coming towards the end now. So just trying to pull things together and rapidly spell out the view that I think we should have, which is, I think, at least strongly suggested by the material that I've just gone through, although to reach the level of careful, precise argumentation that Harvey has is going to take quite a bit more work, right? So some of that work I haven't done yet. So genuine knowing, reaching genuine knowing, which is how I would translate zhi zhi, is both a process that we go through. So there's work that we need to do to get to the point that we can achieve genuine knowing. And it's also then the name for an achievement. I think Wang clearly uses it in both of these senses. And when you have succeeded in reaching genuine knowing, what you're doing is you're experiencing the world purely via your liangzhi. So the inclinations, the emotions, the zhiring that you're doing, all of these things are pure manifestation, are pure liangzhi. So that experiencing the world in this way, I think, is to be sensitive to all the relevant features, right? So you're not ignoring the panhandler as you walk by. So there is, again, there's a perception going on in there, but it isn't the central thing. Sensitivity is important, but what sensitivity is capturing is the fact that as you're experiencing the world purely through your liangzhi, you are feeling all of these things. You are experiencing this, joyful commiseration with everything in whatever immediately relevant situation that everything happens to be configured in. And to do that is to have transformed one's renxin, which is, your everyday heart mind with its foibles and so on and so forth, into a daoxin, which is still your actual everyday heart mind, but now purified. Now the selfishness is gone. And so again, you're just experiencing liangzhi. So a final question that I want to ask is, if liangzhi is what I've been describing and is centrally about this joyful commiseration with all things, right? Then why is it called knowing? Why is it called zhiring at all? Now, admittedly, Wang does have a whole sort of conversational thread about sensory knowing, the jianwen or wenjian zhizhi, and it plays a sort of useful subsidiary role in our lives. So if we have the pure, proper kind of affective concern for our parents or for our friend, but don't know basic things about how to interact with the material world, then we might be concerned with Wang's example is that you might have to know how to cool your parents down in warm, when there's a warm temperature. Like, okay, fan them or something like that. If you don't know these basic things, then you might be concerned for their discomfort and fail to actually act on it. So there's a role for that, but what really is doing the work, what's important is liangzhi. So I ask the passage from the classic text Mengzi that liangzhi, this term, comes from, is in that passage we actually find liangzhi paired with another term, liangneng, or which you could translate maybe as good ability, right? It's something that we can do without having to learn it. So why isn't that what Wang is emphasizing? Why does he choose to talk about knowing, which is leading to all this potential confusion? Well, it seems to me that at least two reasons, and I've thought of others, but I'm not quite as convinced by them, is that one of Wang's clear targets is people who overemphasize the sort of learning for the examinations, learning texts, who are really good with rhetoric and words and so on and so forth, right? What he and his fellow critics call vulgar learning, and he wants to have a reason to show how that is wrong about what Confucians should care about, even though what these vulgar learning people are doing is they're paying a lot of attention to Confucian texts, right? So he doesn't want to just be sort of changing the subject. He wants to show how they're wrong about this central part of Confucianism. So in that gives him a motivation to want to say that they're wrong about what it is to zhi, right? Rather than that there's this other thing that you should do instead. And a second reason is that, in fact, throughout Neo-Confucianism, there's been a discourse about or attention paid to something that many prior philosophers before Wang Yangming called virtuous nature's knowing, 德性之知. And so they contrast sensory knowing with this thing, the knowing of the virtuous nature. This goes back to the Song Dynasty. And it's got a lot in common with what Wang is talking about. Wang does not use this term. That's not the way he frames it. But I think that we can, again, see that here's a kind of, again, it's a kind of zhi, which has some real significant similarities to what Wang is saying. So not to say that Wang isn't saying anything novel, but the idea that engaging with these kinds of questions is to debate about what real zhi is, seems to me to have a lot of pedigree. So that means it's important to Wang that he's talking about zhi and not talking about other things, or not only talking about other things. And so that seems to me to give us a reason to still want to use knowing, but to do so, and therefore to talk about epistemology, but to insist that we do so in a sort of expanded sense, where to zhi something might be centrally about having an affective reaction to it, rather than, and secondarily, to have some kind of doxastic dimension to it. I'm not going to deny that there's a doxastic dimension. But in a certain sense, what I want to do is flip Harvey's argument on its head and say, because he's willing to say, yeah, there's some affect, but the real work is being done by belief-like states. And I think that's backwards. So the final slide is then to reiterate the genuine knowing on this view is to experience the world purely via one's liang zhi. So all, as I say, non-degenerate instances of zhiing are affective. So you might have an instance of zhi where you experience no affect, where you say, yes, I know I should care for my parents, but don't feel anything, right? But that's clearly, explicitly in Wang Yangming, that's a bad instance, a shallow knowing and so on. So that's not a good instance of zhi, which I think allows us to say that liang zhi, so here's my kind of reasoning, right? Liang zhi are perfect affective responses. There's a whole nother story, which I haven't said anything about, but could, whereby we judge which affective responses are liang zhi by our affective responses to them. And that's how you get perfect self-correcting emotion, or at least some approximation thereof. Thank you very much. Please.
Shame is a tricky word, of course, going to be outside searching and inside catching. So how the two work together. I work on literature and very early with the idea that the stillness that provoked the response inside. And so that's none of us sees your own perception, doesn't seem to do it, right? But the response idea seems wrong.
Right.
I shared the idea that, people who have refined themselves would have the exact same response, the exact same, right? But they have a hard time with it.
Right.
Also, the use of the mirror as the model. They can think that
Right. Right.
That going on in Wang Yangming?
For sure. Absolutely.
Sure to go. Response.
Right.
traditional discussion in literature, right? It's going to happen, right? But then the response part is most important.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. If insofar as we want to talk about perception, which, right, the structure of my talk is that's not the emphasis. Insofar as we do want to talk about it, I think that it's not just a kind of a passive noticing, right? So the Gan Ying are interrelated to one another. So there's a story there. But basically, I think I just want to agree, accept what you're saying, that this the response side of all of the things in that column one, right, are very important. There is it's much clearer with inclination with yi and qing, but I think that we should also see it there in zhi, at least in the right kind of zhi, right? So again, that affectless, I know I should care for my parents. Perhaps there's no response there, but that's precisely why it's problematic, right? Yeah. So great, thank you. Sonia?
So thanks to your talk, I now understood how related was speaker. And it's me, it's not him. I remember when reading about this distinction between perceptual model and introspective model, thinking that the strength of the former model is that it allows room for intentionality of the process. I use that word cautiously. I just don't want to just talk about interconnectedness, but something more about stimuli bringing forth a response. So it's not just about the fact that we're always related, but things bring forth a response from the heart mind. So you sidestepped that distinction and introduced the affective model. And I was wondering whether the affective model, aside from acknowledging the affective side of the process, but it also views, again, intentionality to be a necessary part of the process. And I guess this relates more to the issue of the response. Is it more like a mirror or maybe a bit more active like water? Or in general, would you like to commit to the view that intentionality and interaction with the environment and stimuli bring forth just emotions from the heart mind, that is also a necessary part of the affective model?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm frankly a little bit unsure about even the term affective model, because I don't want to suggest that that's the only thing going on. That all there is some kind of undirected generalized affect. And in the longer paper, I talk more about the role of the continuity between shallow knowing and genuine knowing, if you will, right? In that there is conceptual content, right? Or which I think is partly what you're talking about in terms of intentionality. In both of them, right? This is another part of the story about why Wang is talking about Liang Zhi and not Liang Neng, perhaps, right? Is that there is this whole side. So I want to say that the central, the primary explanatory thing that is going on in the whole ecology of Zheng is affective, right? And that's pretty much completely absent on, I think, really any of the pictures that Harvey talks about. So the choice to emphasize affect in the name is not, if that has the result of people misunderstanding me to not think that intentionality is part of the picture, then I've got to think of a new name for the view. Okay. Okay, good. That's a good outcome, because that's what I want. Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Question of Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism and also Wang Yangming. And so the Neo-Confucians were not happy Wang Yangming seems to be accepting some of the influence factor. And so do you see any of that going on in what you're talking about?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. And I think that the relationship between Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism is super interesting and complicated. Well, I have a paper in a volume called The Buddhist Roots of Jushi's Philosophy that focuses on Jushi's version of epistemology. And the I think that there's just multiple layers of influence of Buddhism on Confucianism and vice versa. Taoism, of course, playing a role as well. And so even by the time that Song Daoxue gets going, there's already an enormous shared vocabulary and shared set of texts that people are referencing, which means that inevitably there's going to be a lot of resemblances. And the argument that I make in that paper is that when you really look at the details and when you look at the philosophical arguments that Wang Yangming is making, he genuinely disagrees with the Buddhists, notwithstanding some important sort of what I think are ultimately superficial similarities, rhetorical similarities. And there's a degree to which I'd say the same thing about Wang, although Wang is a different person, and as you say, I think is true, is engaged with a different set of Buddhist sort of interlocutors. But I do think that there is at base a real difference between what the Neo-Confucians as a whole want to say about something like Zhi, and what I think all Buddhists want to say, but you can't lump them all together, right? So different schools of Chan and Tiantai and Huayan and so on and so forth. But I think that the difference isn't always what the Neo-Confucians say it is. The Buddhists are selfish or whatever. But I think that there are real differences that come down to at some level whether there's an objective right answer, right? Whether Tian Li represents the fact that there's a correctness that we can cultivate ourselves, we can learn, and then we can manifest. And so Wang certainly believes that is the case in a way that I think Buddhists would be unhappy with. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Or on intellectual history
Yeah,
side,
yeah.
you mentioned that you see this depiction or description of Zhi as sort of contrasting to Sushya and this study of Confucianism, mostly for the examination.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any contemporary responses from people who he would have categorized as Sushya, who did understand Wang Yangming's definition of Zhi, but just didn't agree with it, and whether or not their writing would also be a helpful way of just sort of supplementing this presentation.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think that you don't tend to get people saying, I'm a card-carrying advocate of vulgar learning, right? But you certainly have people pushing back in a variety of ways, maybe identifying themselves as followers of Jushi. And I think that it would be completely wrong to accuse Jushi himself of having advocated that which Wang took to be vulgar learning. But it might not be so wrong to say that there are some later people who claim to be following what they think Jushi wants, who are doing what Wang says vulgar learning is. But there are also, of course, going to be later either Jushi fans or people otherly situated who are critical of what they see as too much of an abandonment of any sort of external objective checks on what's right and wrong. And so one of the main sources of external standards of what's right and wrong are the classics, right? And so definitely, so Wang's contemporary Luo Qinshun is somebody who engages with him in letters, and Luo is somebody who definitely feels like there needs to be a kind of a back and forth between the gu of the external things like the texts and the people out there in the world and the internal of our heart mind. And that's a sort of a dialectical process for him, where Wang puts much less emphasis on that sort of process. And then you get folks, highly critical of the unification of knowledge and action, and thinking that he's just getting rid of the part played by sort of the external objective knowledge side of things. So for sure, I think that this kind of reception helps us to not always automatically to know what he meant, but at least how he was read. And that's super important. Thanks. Yeah. You would, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's great. As you know, that I'm a scholar of contemporary grassroots Confucianism.
Yes.
And one thing I noticed is also in the contemporary grassroots, Wang Yangming, of course, Yangming poetry, like a comparison in some way. Yeah. But in the contemporary ethnography I did, there's a very strong tendency of moralization of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And here I just find interesting, eventually you choose like a genuine knowing, it's less moralized than like a good thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also, it's also interesting that we see affective model, I think compared with like the more cognitive model of knowing, kind of carve out some room to talk about like morality, moralization. Right? So I just curious, how you think about like either like your own reading of Wang Yangming's like affective epistemology, in that like a moralized theory of knowing, or the word interpretation you're giving here, do you think is kind of give some new way to think about like morality?
So, okay, yeah, no, that's really interesting. And partly the answer is in this point, the self-correction. Because the worry, I think, when we talk about sort of highly moralized discourses, is that they can become invulnerable to criticism. And if and can go in different ways, but something coming out of Wang Yangming might be somebody insisting, I know my Liangzhi, my pure Liangzhi is telling me, and that's all there is to it, right? So it doesn't matter what you say. And so I think that there is evidence in Wang's text that he saw something like this self-correcting idea. It comes out even more explicitly in some of his later followers or critics. So in Liu Zhongzhou, for instance, has some ideas where I think it's complicated because he uses some terms differently and so on, but there is built into the idea of this sort of joyful commiseration, a sort of internal regulatory function. But that is not necessarily something that an outsider can appeal to. Or I don't know, maybe it is. That's not something that these guys talked about, right? But that would be an interesting next step. So if we want to try to take this seriously, and we're worried about the moralization and the immunity to critique, is there a way that we can say, an outsider could say, okay, excuse me, could you, do you really not feel any sense of self-doubt or something, something? I don't know. We'd have to figure out how that would go. It's interesting to think about.
But also interesting. They focus on themselves.
Yeah.
But it's also implicitly simultaneously actually criticizing others.
So
it's more likely to be
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't need to say anything.
Right.
But simultaneously all the other people.
Right. Right, right, right. Yeah. No, indeed. So do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, so I have a question about like, you know how like William first based off his research of Juxi, and then he kind of failed at the Go part, so he went back to
Yeah.
the Zhizhi part.
Uh-huh.
So do you think he's making the Go Zhizhi like practical, or do you think he created a new theory and made it practical?
So I think the relationship between Jushi and Wang Yangming is really interesting and complicated. And it's so there are one layer is, I think, clear where Wang understands and appreciates what Jushi says, and that's probably the bulk of it. And then there are places where Wang perhaps misunderstands and disagrees with what he misunderstands in Jushi. And then there's parts which I think are the smallest part, where he correctly understands and disagrees, right? So probably the Gewu part is somewhere in the second and third, where he is attributing a kind of a practice to Jushi that feels to me uncharitable. The Jew wouldn't recognize as that's what I'm teaching, but it's not wholly distinct from what Jushi is talking about, right? So there's a lot of work that's been done trying to show that Jushi is also an advocate of a kind of a Xinxue, right? A kind of a heart-mind learning that ultimately Jushi wants to transform the Renxin into the Daoxin. And so it isn't just about some kind of learning external things in the way that Wang sometimes uncharitably says Jushi thinks. So I think it's like it's a combination of both of what you're suggesting. That he very clearly wants to redirect the target of learning internally, which to some degree Jushi would agree with, right? But Zhu is going to be worried that Wang goes too far, right? And on the other hand, Wang is concerned that Zhu tempts people to rely too much on just the external. And indeed, that led to this whole vulgar learning stuff. Or I don't know, we can't blame it all on Jushi, but there's a relationship there for sure. So they both have some good points, I would say.